Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the trenches. Not the metaphorical kind where you argue with your boss about quarterly projections. Not the kind where you're stuck in a difficult conversation with your in-laws about politics. I mean actual trenches. Muddy, rat-infested, shell-cratered ditches carved into the farmland of Belgium and France, where the medical care consisted of a flask of whiskey, a roll of bandages that had been used 3 times already, and a surgeon who learned his craft by practicing on the soldiers who died yesterday. We're talking about World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, which it absolutely did not, the war that changed everything, including medicine, especially medicine. Because nothing accelerates scientific progress quite like 4 years of unprecedented human suffering on an industrial scale. Before 1914, medicine was making progress, slowly, carefully, the way science is supposed to work, with controlled experiments and peer-reviewed papers and decades of gradual refinement. Then the war started, and suddenly there were millions of wounded men who needed help right now, and the old methods weren't working, and doctors had to figure out new ones while shells were exploding 50 yards away. It's remarkable, really, how much creativity emerges when the alternative is watching people die. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always 2 in the morning somewhere, and somehow that's always when people find these videos. Maybe there's something about the middle of the night that makes stories about historical trauma feel appropriate. I don't know. I just make them. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and try not to think too hard about gangrene. Actually, we're going to talk about gangrene quite a bit tonight, so maybe just accept that it's going to be a theme and make your peace with it now. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what happened when a soldier got shot before antibiotics existed? Like, really wondered. Not in the abstract, heroic black and white movie kind of way, but in the specific, visceral, what would it actually feel like kind of way. Did military doctors actually know what they were doing? Or were they just enthusiastic butchers with medical degrees and good intentions? What did they give you for pain when the morphine ran out, which was always? How do you perform surgery in a trench while shells are exploding nearby and the whole earth is shaking and your patient is screaming and you haven't slept in 2 days? Would you trust a man to remove shrapnel from your chest if his only qualification was that he'd done it 6 times that morning and 4 of those patients were still alive? Would you feel better or worse knowing that those were actually pretty good odds for 1916? What happened to the soldiers who survived their wounds but came home changed in ways nobody could see? The ones who flinched at loud noises for the rest of their lives, who couldn't sleep without nightmares, who couldn't explain to their families why they weren't the same person who had left. And how did 4 years of industrial slaughter somehow give us blood banks, plastic surgery, modern psychiatry, and the ambulance system we still use today? How did so much death lead to so many ways of preventing death? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in a casualty clearing station on the Western Front. The year is 1916. The Battle of the Somme has been raging for 3 days. You can hear artillery in the distance, a constant rumble like thunder that never stops, and you can smell chlorine and blood and something sweet that you don't want to identify, but is probably exactly what you think it is. The canvas tent above you is stained with things you'd rather not examine closely. The stretcher beneath you is hard and damp, and you're pretty sure the dampness isn't water. And the man approaching you with forceps is covered in mud up to his elbows and hasn't slept in 48 hours. His eyes are red-rimmed and slightly unfocused, but his hands are steady. That's the important thing. His hands are steady. He looks at your wound, looks at the line of stretchers behind you, stretching out the tent flap and into the grey morning light, does some kind of mental calculation and says, "You're lucky. You might actually survive this. Good luck." Let's talk about bullets, not the romantic kind from cowboy movies where someone gets shot in the shoulder and keeps riding, grimacing heroically while a beautiful woman digs out the slug with a pair of tweezers and a shot of whiskey. That's not how bullets work. That's never been how bullets work, but it's especially not how bullets worked in 1914. I mean the bullets of the Great War, high-velocity rounds fired from rifles that could punch through a man at 800 yards, shells that exploded and sent white-hot metal fragments tearing through flesh and bone, machine gun rounds that could fire 600 times per minute, turning human bodies into something unrecognizable, weapons designed by engineers in comfortable offices who had never seen what their inventions would do to human bodies. The soldiers of World War I were about to find out. You're a British private, 19 years old, fresh off a farm in Yorkshire. You volunteered because your friends did, because the recruiting posters made it look like an adventure, because the newspapers said it was your duty, because everyone said it would be over by Christmas, and you didn't want to miss it. Missing it seemed like the worst possible outcome. You'd have to spend the rest of your life explaining why you weren't there when history was being made. It's July 1916, and that Christmas was 2 years ago. You've spent those 2 years learning that war is nothing like the posters suggested. You've learned that adventure smells like latrines and rotting sandbags, and the particular sweetness of bodies that couldn't be recovered from no man's land. You've learned that duty feels like standing in freezing water for hours while rats run over your feet. You've learned that history being made looks like your friends dying in ways you can't describe in letters home, because the censors would cut it out anyway. You're standing in a trench on the first day of the Somme offensive, waiting for the whistle that will send you over the top. Your rifle weighs about 9 pounds. Your pack weighs 60, loaded with ammunition and rations and all the equipment they told you to carry. The mud comes up to your ankles even though it hasn't rained in a week. It's always mud here. The trenches were dug through farmland, and farmland wants to be mud, and 4 million men walking back and forth have helped it along. Somewhere ahead of you, through the smoke and the wire, the German machine guns are waiting. You can't see them. You can't see much of anything except the back of the man in front of you, and the sandbags on either side, and the narrow strip of grey sky above. But you know they're there. Everyone knows they're there. And here's the thing about machine guns in 1916. Nobody in command really understood what they could do. Not yet. Not really. The generals had seen machine guns in colonial wars, mowing down native troops who charged with spears and outdated rifles. That was different. That was technology versus no technology. This was supposed to be different. The generals thought cavalry charges still mattered. They'd brought horses to France, thousands of horses, waiting for the breakthrough that would let them sweep across open country the way cavalry had always done. The generals thought artillery would destroy the enemy positions before the infantry advanced. They'd bombarded the German lines for a week, over 1 million shells, enough explosive to flatten a city. Surely nothing could survive that. Surely the wire would be cut and the trenches would be empty, and the infantry would just walk across and occupy the positions. The generals were wrong. When that whistle blows and you climb out of the trench, you'll be walking into the most lethal killing field in human history. The artillery didn't destroy the German positions. The Germans had dug deep bunkers, 30 feet underground, reinforced with concrete, and they waited out the bombardment, playing cards and writing letters and listening to the shells explode harmlessly above them. When the shelling stopped, they knew what was coming. They climbed out of their bunkers, set up their machine guns, and waited. The wire wasn't cut either. Artillery shells don't cut wire very well. They tangle it, toss it around, sometimes make it worse. The infantry would have to find gaps or cut through it themselves, standing upright in plain view of those machine guns. 20,000 British soldiers will die today. Another 40,000 will be wounded in a single day. The first day of the Battle of the Somme will be the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, and the medical system waiting to receive those casualties was designed for a different kind of war entirely. The British Army Medical Services had planned for a war of movement. Quick battles, decisive victories, wounded soldiers evacuated to hospitals far behind the lines where they could recover in peace. That's how wars were supposed to work. That's how the last major European war had worked, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which lasted less than a year and produced casualties that seemed enormous at the time, but would look trivial compared to what was coming. What the British Army got instead was static trench warfare, industrial-scale casualties, and a front line that barely moved for 4 years. The medical infrastructure collapsed almost immediately. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Supply lines couldn't keep up with demand for bandages, for antiseptics, for morphine, for all the things you need when thousands of wounded men are arriving every hour. Surgeons who had trained for peacetime practice, who had maybe performed a dozen major surgeries in their entire careers, found themselves doing dozens of amputations per day. They learned on the job. They had no choice. The wounds themselves were unlike anything doctors had seen before. A bullet from a Lee Enfield rifle travels at over 2,000 feet per second. When it hits a human body, it doesn't just punch a neat hole like in the movies. Physics doesn't work that way. The bullet tumbles when it hits resistance, transfers its energy into the surrounding tissue, creates a temporary cavity many times its own diameter. Bones don't just break, they shatter into fragments that become secondary projectiles, tearing through muscle and organs. A single bullet can cause dozens of separate internal injuries. Exit wounds are often larger than your fist, and that's just the bullets. The artillery shells were worse, much worse. A high explosive shell throws shrapnel in every direction. jagged metal fragments travelling at hundreds of feet per second, tearing through bodies like tissue paper. Multiple wounds were the norm. A single soldier might have dozens of separate injuries from a single explosion, entry wounds and exit wounds, and pieces of metal still embedded in places the surgeons would have to find by feel. The stretcher bearers who carried the wounded back from no man's land often couldn't tell where one wound ended and another began. Men arrived at the aid stations looking less like patients and more like anatomical puzzles that someone had to solve very quickly. And then there was the mud. The mud that would become synonymous with World War I. The mud that swallowed men and horses and artillery pieces. The mud that filled the trenches and covered the wounded and got into every wound, no matter how carefully you tried to keep it clean. The Western Front was built on farmland in Belgium and northern France, land that had been cultivated for centuries, fertilised with manure, saturated with bacteria that civilian doctors rarely encountered. Land that had been shelled for months by the time the Somme offensive began, churned and rechurned until it was less like soil and more like a toxic paste of dirt, an explosive residue, an organic matter you didn't want to think about. When a shell fragment tore through a soldier's body, it carried soil and cloth and debris deep into the wound. Pieces of uniform, often filthy after weeks in the trenches, were driven into flesh where they became breeding grounds for infection. The bacteria in that soil were particularly nasty. Clostridium perfringens, the organism that causes gas gangrene, thrived in the oxygen-poor environment of deep wounds. It produced toxins that killed tissue and generated gas that you could actually feel crackling under the skin, like bubble wrap, but made of dying flesh. A soldier could survive getting shot in the morning and be dead from gangrene by nightfall. The progression was terrifyingly fast. A wound that looked manageable at noon would be blackened and swollen by evening, the smell unmistakable, the outcome almost certain. The doctors had no antibiotics. Penicillin wouldn't be discovered until 1928, and it wouldn't be widely available until World War II. Sulfur drugs, the first real antibacterials, were still decades away. The best the doctors could do was cut away infected tissue. Cut away tissue that looked healthy but might be contaminated. Cut away limbs when the infection had spread too far to save them. Amputation wasn't a last resort, it was often the first resort. The only way to save a man's life when the infection was spreading faster than any other treatment could work. The surgeons became butchers out of necessity, and the pile of limbs outside the operating tent grew higher every day. The smell on the wards was indescribable, sweet and rotten and chemical all at once, a mixture of carbolic acid and gangrene and blood and unwashed bodies and fear. Nurses learned to recognize the smell of gangrene before they saw the wound. It meant amputation at best, death at worst, and there was rarely a good option in between. Some nurses said they could smell death itself, could tell which patients wouldn't make it just by the way the air changed around their beds. Maybe that was superstition. Maybe it was pattern recognition, honed by too much experience with dying men. Either way, the smell never left them. Veterans of those wards reported smelling it for the rest of their lives, triggered by random moments, by a particular combination of sweetness and rot, by memories they couldn't escape. The war forced medicine to evolve faster than it ever had before. Techniques that would have taken decades to develop in peacetime were invented, tested, and implemented within months. Doctors didn't have time for controlled studies or peer review. They tried things. If more patients lived than died, they kept doing it. If more patients died than lived, they tried something else. The X-ray machine, barely 20 years old and still considered somewhat experimental, became standard equipment in field hospitals. Surgeons could see inside the body without cutting, could locate shrapnel and bullet fragments, could identify fractures that might otherwise have been missed. The machines were bulky and unreliable, required careful handling and expertise that many operators didn't have, but they were better than nothing. Much better than nothing. Surgeons learned to debride wounds aggressively, cutting away damaged tissue to prevent infection from spreading. The technique wasn't new, but the scale was unprecedented. Peacetime surgeons might perform 1 or 2 debridements in a year. Wartime surgeons did dozens per day, developing an intuition for how much tissue to remove, learning to balance the risk of taking too little against the damage of taking too much. The concept of the golden hour emerged from the desperate mathematics of battlefield triage. Get to a wounded soldier fast enough, within 60 minutes of injury, and you might save him. Wait too long, and nothing would help. The clock started when the bullet hit, and every minute that passed reduced the odds of survival. Every decision had consequences. Every moment of delay could mean the difference between a man going home to his family and a telegram that started with, "We regret to inform you." The medical officers of World War I were learning in real time, and their classroom was a slaughterhouse. The lessons they learned would save countless lives in the decades to come, but the tuition was paid in blood by men who never saw the benefits. Imagine an emergency room, a modern one with bright lights and beeping machines and doctors in clean scrubs and a coffee shop in the lobby. Now, remove the walls, remove the electricity, remove the running water, the sterile equipment, the trained nurses, the antibiotics, the anesthesiologists, the blood bank, the imaging department, and most of the doctors. Now put it in a tent 3 miles from the front line. Fill it with 500 screaming men, and add the constant threat of artillery bombardment. Congratulations, you've just invented the casualty clearing station. This is where you'll end up if you're lucky enough to survive getting shot. Not immediately, of course. First, you'll lie in the mud where you fell, possibly for hours, while stretcher bearers try to reach you under fire. The stretcher bearers were some of the bravest men in the war, unarmed, carrying nothing but a canvas stretcher and a water bottle, crossing no man's land while machine guns rattled and shells exploded around them. They worked in pairs, usually, crawling through the craters and the wire, trying to find the wounded among the dead, making impossible choices about who to carry back and who to leave. A stretcher with a wounded man on it weighed over 200 pounds. Carrying that weight across broken ground, through mud that sucked at your boots, under fire, for hundreds of yards, sometimes miles, was exhausting beyond description. Many stretcher bearers collapsed before they reached the aid station. Many were killed alongside the men they were trying to save. The mortality rate for stretcher bearers was nearly as high as for combat troops, and they never fired a shot. They just walked into the killing fields, picked up broken men, and walked back out, over and over, all day, all night, for as long as the battle lasted. If the stretcher bearers reach you, you'll be carried to a regimental aid post, which is basically a hole in the ground with a medical officer and some bandages. The aid post is close to the front line, sometimes only a few hundred yards back, which means it's still in range of enemy fire. The medical officer there can stop bleeding, apply basic dressings, give morphine if he has any left. He can't do surgery. He can't do much of anything except keep you alive long enough to reach the next level of care. He makes notes on a tag attached to your uniform: wound location, treatments given, priority for evacuation. Your life has been reduced to a few scribbled words on a piece of cardboard. Then, if you're still alive, you'll be loaded onto a horse-drawn ambulance and bounced along shell-cratered roads to the clearing station. The roads were never meant for this kind of traffic. Farm roads, mostly, designed for carts and cattle, now carrying a continuous stream of ambulances and supply wagons and artillery pieces. The shells had cratered them, the rain had flooded them, the constant traffic had churned them into rivers of mud. The ambulances had no suspension to speak of. Every bump, every crater, every rock in the road translated directly into the stretchers, into the wounds, into the men who screamed or bit through their lips trying not to scream. The whole process, from wounding to clearing station, might take 12 hours, sometimes longer. By the time you arrive, infection has already set in. The clearing station is organised chaos. Rows of stretchers on the ground, each one holding a man in some stage of injury or dying. Doctors move between them, making impossible decisions with only seconds to evaluate each case. This one might live with surgery. This one will die no matter what we do. This one needs more care than we can provide here. The system they use is called triage, a French word that means sorting. It was invented during the Napoleonic Wars by a surgeon named Dominique Jean Larrey, but World War I perfected it into something brutal and necessary. Larrey had the luxury of dealing with hundreds of casualties. The doctors at the Somme were dealing with tens of thousands. You don't treat the most seriously wounded first. That seems cruel, inhuman even, but there's a terrible logic to it. The most seriously wounded are often going to die anyway. The resources you spend on them, the surgeon's time, the blood, the bandages, could save 3 or 4 men with moderate wounds. So you don't treat the most seriously wounded first. You treat the ones most likely to survive. The ones who will die anyway get morphine and a quiet corner, and a nurse who holds their hand if one can be spared. The ones with minor wounds, the ones who can walk, the ones who will recover without much intervention, they wait, sometimes for days. The system sounds heartless, and it is. But when you have 3 surgeons and 400 patients, and more arriving every hour, heartless is the only thing that works. The clearing stations operated in 3 categories. Walking wounded went to one area, where they could wait for transport to base hospitals further behind the lines. These were the lucky ones, in a sense. Wounded badly enough to be evacuated, not badly enough to die. A bullet through the flesh of the arm, missing the bone. Shrapnel wounds that looked dramatic but hadn't hit anything vital. Fractures that could be splinted and would heal with time. They called it a blighty wound, blighty being slang for Britain. A wound bad enough to send you home, but not bad enough to kill you. Soldiers sometimes fantasized about blighty wounds. Some were rumoured to have inflicted wounds on themselves, shooting through their own hands or feet, desperate enough to face a court-martial if it meant escaping the trenches. The army took a dim view of self-inflicted wounds, but proving intent was difficult, and the doctors usually didn't try too hard. Serious cases that might benefit from immediate surgery went to the operating tent. These were the calculated risks, the men who would probably die without surgery but might survive with it. Abdominal wounds, chest wounds, compound fractures with major bleeding. The surgeons worked as fast as they dared, trying to save as many as possible before the next wave of casualties arrived. And the moribund, the ones who couldn't be saved, went to a separate area where they could die with whatever comfort was available. Morphine, if there was any left. A blanket, a nurse or a chaplain to sit with them. The certain knowledge that nothing more could be done. The doctors making these decisions had seconds to evaluate each case. They looked at the wound, the patient's vital signs, the colour of his skin, the strength of his pulse. They made a call, right or left, operating table or morphine, life or death. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes a man they sent to the moribund ward rallied and survived. And sometimes a man they operated on died on the table or an hour later from shock or infection. The mathematics of mass casualties don't allow for certainty. You do your best with the information you have, and you live with the results. Or you don't live with them, because plenty of the doctors broke down too, overwhelmed by the impossible choices they had to make. The physical layout of a clearing station was surprisingly systematic given the chaos. There was a reception area where casualties were sorted, doctors and orderlies moving down the lines making rapid assessments. An operating theatre, usually a large tent with multiple tables so several surgeries could happen simultaneously. Surgeons working side by side on different patients, sharing instruments when supplies ran low. A preoperative ward where patients waited for surgery. Orderlies monitoring them for changes, trying to keep the worst cases alive long enough to reach the table. A post-operative ward where they recovered or didn't, watched by nurses who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. A moribund ward that everyone tried not to think about. And somewhere, usually downwind, a pile of amputated limbs waiting for burial. The stations moved frequently, following the front line as it shifted. When there was an offensive, they moved forward. When the line fell back, they moved back. Everything had to be portable. Tents, tables, equipment, supplies, all of it designed to be packed up and relocated within hours. The staff became experts at setting up and tearing down, at creating order from chaos, at making do with whatever they had. A shortage of bandages meant reusing ones that had been washed, sometimes imperfectly. A shortage of morphine meant patients screaming through procedures that should have been painless. A shortage of surgeons meant medical students operating on their own, learning by doing because there was no one to teach them. When the big offensives came, the Somme in 1916, Passchendaele in 1917, the clearing stations were overwhelmed beyond anything they'd been designed to handle. The casualties arrived faster than they could be processed. Stretchers filled every available space, then spilled outside into the mud. Surgeons operated until they collapsed from exhaustion, were revived with coffee or something stronger, and went back to operating. Nurses worked 20-hour shifts, then 24, then longer, because there was no one to relieve them. The wounded kept coming, an endless stream of broken bodies, and the only choice was to keep working or let them die. Most kept working. What else could they do? The surgeon approaching your stretcher is 26 years old. 6 months ago, he was a medical student in Edinburgh, learning anatomy from textbooks and cadavers, dreaming of a comfortable practice in a respectable neighbourhood, maybe specialising in something clean and predictable like dermatology. Now he's performed more amputations than most civilian surgeons see in a lifetime. His hands are steady, which is remarkable, considering he's been operating for 14 hours straight on nothing but tea and adrenaline, and the knowledge that there are 200 more patients waiting. His apron is so stained with blood that you can't tell what colour it started as. Probably white. Everything starts white and ends red here. He looks at your leg, at the jagged hole where the shrapnel went in, at the swelling that suggests the bone is shattered, at the discoloration that might be bruising or might be the beginning of something worse. He makes a decision in about 3 seconds, because that's all the time he has. You're keeping the leg. Probably. Maybe. If the bone isn't too badly damaged, if the infection hasn't spread too far, if nothing goes wrong during surgery, if a lot of things. But probably. The operating theatre is a canvas tent with wooden tables and hurricane lamps for light. The lamps flicker and smoke, casting shifting shadows that make fine work difficult. In winter, the surgeons can see their breath. In summer, the heat under the canvas is suffocating, and flies swarm around the wounds no matter how hard the orderlies try to keep them away. In the corner, there's a pile of limbs from today's amputations, arms and legs stacked like firewood, anonymous now, no longer connected to the men they belong to. Nobody has had time to bury them yet. They'll get to it eventually. They always do. The anaesthetic, if you're lucky, is chloroform dripped onto a gauze mask held over your nose and mouth. Chloroform isn't perfect. The dosage is hard to control. Too little and you wake up during the surgery. Too much and you don't wake up at all. The anaesthetist, if there is one, watches your breathing, adjusts the drip, tries to keep you in that narrow window between consciousness and death. Sometimes there isn't an anaesthetist. Sometimes the surgeon does it himself. One eye on your breathing, the other on the wound he's trying to repair. Sometimes they're running low on chloroform, and then it's a leather strap to bite on and 4 orderlies to hold you down while the surgeon does his work as fast as he can. Speed matters. Every second of agony is a second the patient might go into shock, might thrash and injure himself further, might die from the sheer trauma of unmedicated surgery. The surgeon's tools are basic but effective. A scalpel for cutting, forceps for gripping and extracting, bone saws for amputations, several sizes for different limbs, clamps for stopping bleeding, retractors for holding wounds open, sutures and needles for closing up afterward. Everything is supposed to be sterilised in carbolic acid between patients, but in the chaos of a major offensive, supposed to and actually are 2 different things. Carbolic acid burns the skin. The surgeon's hands are raw and cracked from constant exposure. Some develop sensitivity reactions. Some just work through the pain because there's no alternative. Infection isn't just a risk. It's an expectation. The Western Front is farmland that's been shelled for 2 years. The soil is saturated with manure from centuries of farming, with human waste from millions of soldiers living in trenches with inadequate sanitation, with the decomposed remains of soldiers who died in previous battles and couldn't be recovered. The whole landscape is a bacterial nightmare. Every wound is contaminated with organisms that civilian doctors have never seen and have no idea how to treat. Gas gangrene, a condition so rare before the war that it barely appeared in medical textbooks, becomes an epidemic. The bacteria, Clostridium perfringens and its cousins, thrive in deep wounds where oxygen is scarce. They eat living tissue and produce gas that accumulates under the skin, creating a characteristic crackling sensation when you press on the affected area. The skin turns grey, then brown, then black. The smell is unmistakable, sweet and putrid. The smell of death arriving ahead of schedule. Soldiers survive getting shot only to die 3 days later from wounds that turn black and spread faster than any surgeon can cut. The treatment is aggressive surgical removal of all infected flesh, a procedure called debridement. The surgeon cuts away everything that's dead, everything that's dying, everything that looks even slightly suspicious. Better to remove too much than too little. Better to leave a gaping wound that can be packed with antiseptic gauze than to leave a tiny pocket of bacteria that will multiply overnight and kill the patient by morning. Even that doesn't always work. Sometimes the infection has spread beyond where the surgeon can see, travelling along muscle planes and fascia, hiding in places that look healthy until it's too late. The mortality rate for gas gangrene cases is staggering. Even with aggressive surgery, even with perfect care, many of them die. The antiseptics of 1916 were primitive by modern standards. Carbolic acid was the most common, the same substance Joseph Lister had pioneered decades earlier. It worked, sort of. It killed bacteria. It also killed healthy tissue, damaged healing, and left chemical burns that sometimes caused their own complications. Doctors began experimenting with alternatives: iodine solutions, hydrogen peroxide, salt water, various combinations and concentrations tested on patients because there was no time for laboratory studies. The breakthrough came from an unlikely collaboration. Alexis Carrel, a French surgeon working with the American forces, teamed up with Henry Dakin, a British chemist. Together, they developed Dakin's solution, a diluted form of sodium hypochlorite, essentially bleach. It sounds brutal, putting bleach in a wound, but at the right concentration, it killed bacteria without destroying too much healthy tissue. The key was continuous irrigation, flushing the wound repeatedly to wash out bacteria and dead tissue. The Carrel-Dakin treatment became standard practice by 1917. It wasn't perfect, nothing was perfect, but it saved lives that would have been lost with carbolic acid alone. The solution had to be made fresh because it lost potency within hours. Nurses became experts at preparing it, measuring sodium hypochlorite and boric acid with pharmaceutical precision, mixing and testing and discarding batches that didn't meet specification. They did this while shells fell outside, while patients screamed in the next tent, while their hands cracked and bled from constant exposure to chemicals. The dedication was remarkable. The results were measurable. Survival rates improved. Gangrene cases decreased. Something was finally working. Despite everything, the surgeons saved lives. Lots of lives. The mortality rate for wounded soldiers who reached a clearing station was around 10%. That sounds terrible. 1 in 10 dying even after reaching medical care, until you realize that in previous wars it had been much higher. The American Civil War had mortality rates of over 20% for wounded soldiers, and that was with smaller bullets and slower rates of fire. The combination of faster evacuation, better surgical techniques, improved antiseptics, and the sheer volume of experience gained made a real difference. Not enough of a difference, never enough, but real. The surgeons who survived the war carried their knowledge back to civilian practice. They had seen more trauma, performed more emergency surgery, dealt with more infected wounds than any previous generation of doctors. The lessons they learned in those canvas tents shaped surgical practice for decades. The aggressive debridement, the staged wound closure, the importance of time and speed and decisive action. All of it became standard teaching in medical schools. Every emergency room, every trauma centre, every battlefield hospital since then has built on the foundations laid by exhausted young surgeons operating by candlelight while the guns thundered outside. Here's something that seems obvious now, but wasn't obvious at all in 1914. When people lose blood, they die. And if you give them more blood, sometimes they don't die. Revolutionary, right? The connection between blood loss and death was well understood. Ancient physicians had noticed it. The treatment, however, was another matter entirely. Blood transfusion had been attempted for centuries, with results that ranged from miraculous recoveries to horrible deaths. You'd give someone else's blood to a patient, and sometimes they'd wake up refreshed and healthy, and sometimes they'd convulse and die on the table, their kidneys shutting down, their blood turning to sludge in their veins. Nobody knew why some transfusions worked, and some didn't. It seemed almost random, a matter of luck rather than science. The answer, which we take for granted now, is blood types. Karl Landsteiner, an Austrian physician, had discovered them in 1901. He found that human blood could be classified into groups, which he called A, B, and C, later renamed O. Blood from one group could be safely transfused into people of the same group, but mixing incompatible groups caused the red blood cells to clump together, a reaction that could be fatal. It was a Nobel Prize-worthy discovery, and Landsteiner would eventually receive that prize in 1930. But medical practice moved slowly, especially in peacetime. By 1914, blood typing was still a laboratory curiosity. Most doctors had never performed a transfusion, never seen one performed, had only a vague awareness that blood types existed. The war changed that. When you've got a soldier bleeding out on your operating table, his face grey, his pulse thready, his life measured in minutes, and you've tried everything else, experimental starts looking pretty good. Military doctors began matching blood types before transfusion, testing the patient's blood against potential donors, looking for the clumping reaction that indicated incompatibility. Suddenly, the success rate went up dramatically. Transfusions that would have been fatal became routine. Men who would have died from blood loss survived. The technique spread through the military medical system, from one clearing station to the next, from one army to another, as doctors shared what they'd learned. But there was another problem: fresh blood. In 1915, you couldn't store blood. The moment it left the body, it began to clot, becoming useless within hours. You needed a living donor right there, next to the patient, connected by tubes, while the blood flowed directly from one body to another. This worked, but it was cumbersome. You had to find a donor with compatible blood, get them to the operating tent, connect them to the patient with tubing and syringes, and hope that enough blood would transfer before something went wrong. In the chaos of a major battle, finding compatible donors was nearly impossible. You might have 100 wounded men who needed blood and no way to identify which of them could donate to which others. The Type O donors, the universal donors who could give to anyone, were precious resources, tracked and guarded and summoned whenever a critical case arrived. Then, in 1915, a technique emerged for adding sodium citrate to blood to prevent clotting. The citrate bound to calcium in the blood, and calcium was necessary for the clotting process. Remove the calcium, prevent the clotting, and suddenly you could store blood for days instead of hours. The implications were enormous. You could collect blood before a battle, type it, store it in bottles, and have it ready when the casualties started arriving. You didn't need to find a donor in the middle of surgery. You just reached for a bottle, checked the label for the blood type, and started the transfusion. By 1917, the British Army had established blood depots near the front lines, glass bottles of typed, preserved blood stored in ice-cooled containers, ready to be transfused into dying men. The first blood banks in history, invented not in a research hospital with proper funding and controlled conditions, but in muddy tents a few miles from no man's land, by doctors who were making it up as they went along. The American forces, entering the war that year, adopted and expanded the system. Captain Oswald Robertson established mobile blood banks that could follow the troops, keeping supplies close to where they were needed. The soldier who donated blood in the morning might be receiving someone else's blood by nightfall. It was a closed loop of survival, one small piece of sanity in a completely insane situation. Men who had been enemies with the wounded German in the next bed might share compatible blood types, might save each other's lives without ever knowing it. Blood didn't care about nationality or politics or which side you were fighting for. Blood just kept you alive or didn't. The logistics were surprisingly sophisticated for a system invented under fire. Blood was collected from volunteers, usually lightly wounded soldiers who were healthy enough to donate but not well enough to return to the front immediately. A pint of blood here, another there, contributed to the common supply. The blood was typed using the ABO system, with handwritten labels indicating the group. It was treated with citrate, measured precisely because too much would thin the blood dangerously and too little wouldn't prevent clotting. The bottles were stored in ice-cooled containers, insulated boxes packed with ice from wherever it could be found, which wasn't easy in summer. Transport runners carried the bottles to wherever they were needed, sometimes under fire, sometimes at night through terrain they couldn't see, just following the sound of the guns. The shelf life was short, maybe a week at best, so the system required constant replenishment. Fresh donations came in daily. Old blood was discarded when it passed its expiration. The blood bank became its own operation within the medical system, with dedicated staff and procedures and records. Every bottle tracked, every transfusion documented, every outcome noted. The data would prove invaluable after the war, allowing researchers to refine techniques and understand what worked and what didn't. The doctors learned other lessons about blood. They discovered that transfusion worked best when given early, before the patient went into irreversible shock. A man who received blood within the first hour of major hemorrhage had a much better chance than one who waited several hours. They learned to estimate blood loss by looking at the wound, the patient's colour, their pulse rate, the sweat on their skin. They developed techniques for rapid transfusion, getting blood into the patient as fast as possible when every second counted. They learned that some patients needed more than one transfusion, that the initial bottle might stabilize them, but the surgery would cause more loss that required replacement. Some of this knowledge seems basic now. It wasn't then. Before the war, transfusion was a curiosity, a last resort attempted by desperate doctors with no other options and uncertain results. By the end of the war, it was a standard life-saving intervention with established protocols and proven results. The blood banking systems developed in those wartime hospitals became the templates for civilian blood services. The Red Cross, which had been collecting blood on an ad hoc basis, developed systematic donor programs based on military models. Blood drives, donation centres, typing and screening and storage, all the infrastructure we take for granted today, has its roots in those improvised blood depots on the Western Front. The blood types that Landsteiner had identified became part of standard medical records. When you know your blood type, when you donate blood at your local hospital, when a transfusion saves your life or the life of someone you love, you're benefiting from lessons learned in the desperate conditions of the Great War. Some wounds kill you quickly, some wounds kill you slowly, and some wounds leave you alive but changed in ways that make you wish they hadn't. Let's talk about facial injuries, because this is where we're going now, and I apologize in advance. High explosive shells don't just kill, they maim in specific and horrible ways that nobody had anticipated before the war. Soldiers learned to keep their heads down in the trenches, which was simple survival. The trenches were designed for it, deep enough to protect a standing man from direct fire, with fire steps that let you peek over the parapet when you needed to shoot. But keeping your head down meant your face was often the most exposed part of your body when you were looking over the top, and looking over the top was sometimes necessary. A shell fragment to the face could remove a jaw, could remove an eye, could remove a nose, could remove most of the front of the skull, while leaving the brain somehow intact, the patient alive and conscious and aware that he no longer had a face. These men survived, technically. Their hearts beat, their lungs breathed. Their brains thought the same thoughts they'd always thought. But in 1914, there was almost nothing doctors could do for them beyond basic wound care. Keep the wound clean. Wait for it to heal, however it was going to heal. Send them home to families who would have to look at what was left. They were called the men with broken faces. Some wore tin masks painted to look like skin, crude prosthetics that covered the damage without repairing it. Artists created these masks. Sculptors who studied photographs of the patient before their injury and tried to recreate what they had lost. The masks were remarkable achievements, but they were masks. They didn't move. They didn't smile. They didn't blink. They were uncanny, almost worse than the wounds they covered. Dead faces on living men. Some of the wounded never left the hospital wards. They stayed in special facilities, away from public view, their existence quietly forgotten by the societies that had sent them to war. Some went home to families who tried their best but couldn't always hide their horror, their grief, their instinctive recoil from something that looked wrong in ways that the brain couldn't process. Enter Harold Gillies, a New Zealand surgeon working for the British Army who essentially invented modern plastic surgery by figuring it out as he went along. Gillies had trained in ear, nose, and throat surgery, which gave him some background in facial anatomy, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw when the casualties started arriving. He watched other surgeons struggle with facial wounds, trying techniques borrowed from other types of injury, and decided there had to be a better way. In 1917, he established a dedicated facial injury hospital at Sidcup in Kent, a place where surgeons could focus exclusively on reconstruction, developing and refining techniques that had never been tried before. The hospital became a laboratory for rebuilding faces. Gillies developed techniques for grafting skin from other parts of the body to cover facial wounds. He figured out how to construct new noses using tissue from the forehead, carefully cutting flaps that remained attached to their blood supply while being repositioned to create new structures. The tubed pedicle flap was his signature innovation, a technique that allowed skin to be moved from one part of the body to another while maintaining its blood supply throughout the process. You would create a tube of skin attached at both ends, let it heal into its tube shape, then gradually disconnect one end and reattach it closer to where it was ultimately needed. The process could take months, with the patient walking around with a tube of their own skin hanging from their face or chest, looking bizarre but alive, waiting for the next stage of reconstruction. It was crude by modern standards. The results were imperfect, the techniques improvised, the outcomes unpredictable. It was also miraculous. The before and after photographs from Gillies Hospital are almost impossible to look at, not because the after pictures are disturbing, although many of them are, but because they show men who went from having no face to having a face again. Not their original face, not a face that would pass unnoticed on the street, but a face with a nose and a mouth and cheeks and a chin, something that resembled human, something that let them eat without assistance and breathe without tubes and eventually, maybe, walk down the street without causing strangers to faint. Gillies kept meticulous records. He drew diagrams of his surgical plans, detailed sketches showing how he intended to cut and move and reconstruct. He photographed patients before, during, and after treatment, building an archive that would inform reconstructive surgery for generations. He learned from his failures, which were many, because nobody had ever done this before. Techniques that seemed promising sometimes led to complications, infections, rejections, outcomes worse than what they were trying to fix. He documented those too, because failure was information, and information was how you got better. The patients at Sidcup underwent multiple surgeries, sometimes dozens over the course of years. Between operations, they lived in a community of men who understood what they were going through. The hospital had its own culture, its own rituals, its own dark humour. The patients called themselves the loneliest of Tommies because they knew they would never fully rejoin normal society. Their injuries were too visible, too disturbing, too much a reminder of what war actually did to human bodies. But they supported each other, formed friendships, created a society of the disfigured where appearance didn't matter because everyone's appearance was damaged. Gillies supported them too. He treated his patients as collaborators, not just bodies to be fixed. He explained what he was doing, listened to their preferences, adjusted his plans based on their feedback. What do you want your nose to look like? How much risk are you willing to accept? Would you prefer this approach or that one? This was unusual for the time, when doctors were expected to be godlike authorities and patients were expected to shut up and do as they were told. Gillies recognized that these men would have to live with the results of his surgeries, and they should have a voice in what those results looked like. Every plastic surgery procedure performed today traces its lineage back to that hospital in Kent, where a New Zealand surgeon tried to give soldiers their faces back. Rhinoplasty, jaw reconstruction, skin grafting, facial transplantation, all of it flows from the work done at Sidcup. Gillies trained a generation of surgeons who spread his techniques around the world. His cousin, Archibald Mackindo, would use those same techniques to treat burned pilots in World War II, creating the guinea pig club of airmen who underwent extensive reconstructive surgery. The field of plastic surgery, which barely existed before 1914, emerged from the war as a recognized specialty with established methods and proven results. When a burn victim receives skin grafts, when a cancer patient has their face reconstructed after tumor removal, when anyone undergoes cosmetic surgery for any reason, they're benefiting from techniques pioneered on the broken faces of the Western Front. Not all wounds bleed. Not all damage shows up on an X-ray or presents as a visible injury. By 1915, a new condition was filling the hospitals of Europe. Soldiers who could walk and talk and had no visible injuries, but who shook uncontrollably, couldn't speak, couldn't hear, couldn't remember their own names, couldn't stop screaming in the night. Men who had been healthy and brave and capable, who had volunteered eagerly, who had fought well, suddenly unable to function at all. The military called it shell shock because they thought it was caused by the physical concussion of artillery explosions. If enough shells went off near you, the theory went, the vibrations damaged your brain. Microscopic injuries from pressure waves, invisible but real, disrupting the nervous system in ways that caused these bizarre symptoms. It was a convenient explanation because it made shell shock a physical wound, which meant it deserved treatment and sympathy. A man with shell shock wasn't a coward or a malingerer. He was injured just as surely as if he'd lost a leg. His brain had been damaged by enemy action and he needed medical care, not punishment. The truth was more complicated. Some shell shock cases had never been near an explosion. They had simply seen too much, experienced too much, lost too many friends, spent too many nights waiting to die. They had watched men they loved get torn apart by machine gun fire. They had stepped over bodies so numerous they stopped being individual deaths and became terrain features. They had killed, sometimes at close range, sometimes face to face, and something in them had broken that couldn't be explained by pressure waves. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, the military of 1916 had no name for and no way to understand. The closest analogy was hysteria, a diagnosis primarily applied to women, associated with emotional weakness and feminine frailty. Applying it to soldiers, to men, to warriors who were supposed to be strong was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Better to call it shell shock and pretend it was physical. Treatment ranged from rest cures, basically lying in bed in a quiet environment and hoping you got better, to approaches that would qualify as torture today. One popular method was applying electric shocks to the affected body part. Can't move your arm? Here's some voltage to remind it how to work. Can't speak? Let's electrify your throat. Can't stop shaking? Maybe a few 100 volts will steady your nerves. The theory, such as it was, held that shell shock was a form of hysteria, a weakness of will that could be shocked out of the patient. The reality was that terrified men were being tortured for the crime of being terrified. Some doctors applied the shocks enthusiastically, convinced they were providing effective treatment. Others did it reluctantly, aware that it seemed cruel but desperate for something that might work. It's hard to say whether electrical treatment helped anyone. Some patients recovered, but some patients recovered without treatment too. The human mind has remarkable healing capacity given enough time and support. Whether the electricity contributed to recovery or just added trauma on top of trauma is impossible to know. What we do know is that many patients found the treatment terrifying, that some refused it, that some were forced to undergo it anyway. The line between treatment and punishment was blurry, and many shell-shock patients felt they were being punished for becoming sick. The more enlightened approach, pioneered by doctors like W.H.R. Rivers in Britain, was actually talking to patients about what they'd experienced. It sounds obvious now. Of course, you should talk to trauma victims about their trauma. Of course, suppressing painful memories doesn't make them go away. Of course, human beings need to process their experiences, especially the terrible ones. It was revolutionary then. Rivers worked at Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Scotland, treating officers who had broken down. His most famous patient was the poet Siegfried Sassoon, who had been sent there after publicly protesting the war. Sassoon had thrown his military cross into a river and written a declaration calling the war a deliberate prolongation of suffering for political ends. The army could have court-martialed him for cowardice or sedition. Instead, they declared him mentally ill and sent him to Rivers. Rivers didn't try to shock Sassoon back to health. He talked to him. He listened to his experiences, his grief, his anger, his guilt. He helped him process what he'd seen and done. The friends he'd lost, the enemy soldiers he'd killed, the conviction that none of it meant anything. Rivers didn't try to change Sassoon's political views. He didn't argue that the war was justified. He simply provided a space where Sassoon could think through his experiences and decide what to do with them. Eventually, Sassoon chose to return to the front, not because he'd been convinced the war was right, but because he couldn't abandon his men. The idea that psychological trauma needed psychological treatment was not widely accepted. Soldiers were expected to be strong, to endure, to not complain. The stiff upper lip, the British way. The ones who couldn't were often labelled as cowards or malingerers, men who were using fake illness to escape their duty. Some were shot for desertion when their real crime was being too broken to function. The British Army executed over 300 soldiers for desertion or cowardice during the war. Many of them had what we would now recognise as severe PTSD. They couldn't fight because they couldn't function, because their nervous systems had been overwhelmed by trauma, because something in their minds had simply stopped working, and they were killed for it, by their own side, often within days of their breakdown. Shell shock forced the military, and eventually the medical establishment, to acknowledge that the mind could be wounded just like the body, that invisible injuries were real, that you couldn't simply order a man to stop being traumatized any more than you could order him to regrow a missing leg, that sending a man back to the front after he'd watched his best friends die in agony was maybe not the best treatment plan. The psychiatric hospitals of World War I were laboratories for understanding trauma, even if the understanding came too late for most of the patients. The concepts developed there, the talking cure, the importance of processing traumatic memories, the recognition that psychological wounds are as real as physical ones, all of these became foundations of modern psychiatry. We still don't fully understand trauma. The brain remains mysterious in ways that other organs aren't, but we understand it better than we did. And that understanding began in hospitals where shell-shocked soldiers stared at walls and doctors tried to figure out how to bring them back. If getting shot was the most common way to get wounded on the Western Front, poison gas was the most terrifying. The first major gas attack happened at Ypres in April 1915, when German forces released 168 tons of chlorine gas from 6,000 cylinders along a 4-mile front. The cylinders had been positioned in the trenches over several weeks, waiting for the wind to blow in the right direction. When it finally did, they opened the valves and let the gas drift toward the Allied lines. The yellow-green cloud rolled across no man's land like fog, hugging the ground, filling the shell craters and trenches, seeking the lowest points where men were sheltering. French and Algerian troops in the path of the cloud had no idea what was happening. Some thought it was a smokescreen for an infantry attack. Some thought it was a new type of explosive. By the time they realized it was poison, it was too late to run. Chlorine gas attacks the lungs. It dissolves in the moisture of the respiratory system and forms hydrochloric acid, burning the delicate tissues from the inside. The lungs respond by producing fluid, trying to dilute the acid and wash it away. But the fluid fills the air spaces, and suddenly you can't breathe. You're drowning in your own body, gasping for air that won't come, coughing up foam that's pink with blood, your eyes and skin burning from the chemical. The soldiers who survived the first attack had no gas masks. They had no training. They didn't even know what was happening. Some instinctively covered their faces with cloth, which helped a little. Some urinated on rags and held them over their noses, the ammonia in the urine neutralizing some of the chlorine. This became official advice until proper masks were developed, which is a sentence I never expected to write. Both sides quickly adopted chemical weapons because that's what happens in war. If the enemy has something terrible, you develop something worse. The British used gas at Loos in September 1915, less than 6 months after condemning the Germans for using it at Ypres. The French used it. Everyone used it. The taboo lasted about 5 minutes, and then it was just another weapon. Chlorine gave way to phosgene, which was more lethal and harder to detect. Phosgene smells like freshly cut hay, a pleasant country scent that gives no warning of what it's doing to your lungs. You might not even know you'd been exposed until hours later, when your lungs started failing and it was too late to do anything about it. Soldiers learned to recognize the smell, to mask up at the first hint of hay in a place where there shouldn't be any. But by then, they'd usually already inhaled enough to cause damage. Phosgene gave way to mustard gas, which didn't kill as efficiently, but caused horrific injuries that were almost worse than death. Mustard gas is a blistering agent. It burns whatever it touches, inside and out. It causes massive blisters on the skin, blindness when it contacts the eyes, internal burns to the mouth, throat, and lungs when inhaled. The burns take weeks to heal, if they heal at all. Some victims were blinded permanently. Some developed chronic respiratory problems that plagued them for the rest of their lives. Mustard gas was particularly insidious because it contaminated everything it touched. It soaked into uniforms, into soil, into wood and metal and canvas. Soldiers could be exposed by walking through an area that had been gassed hours earlier. Their clothes absorbed the chemical and continued burning their skin long after the initial attack. Decontamination was nearly impossible in field conditions. You couldn't wash it off with water. You couldn't air it out. The only solution was to remove contaminated clothing entirely and hope you'd caught it in time. Medical treatment for gas victims was almost entirely supportive. There were no antidotes, not for chlorine, not for phosgene, not for mustard. You kept the patient warm. You gave them oxygen if you had it, which you often didn't. You treated their burns and blisters with whatever you had available. You irrigated their eyes and hoped they would see again. You watched their lungs and hoped they would keep working. Many soldiers survived the initial exposure only to develop chronic respiratory problems that would kill them years or decades later. The damage was cumulative and permanent. Every exposure made the next one worse. The gas wards were among the most disturbing places in any military hospital. Rows of men gasping for breath, their skin blistered and peeling, their eyes bandaged, their lungs making sounds that human lungs shouldn't make. Wet, crackling sounds, gurgling sounds, the sound of drowning without water. The doctors could do very little except document what they saw. That documentation eventually led to international treaties banning chemical weapons, for whatever those treaties have been worth. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. Most countries signed it. Some ignored it when convenient. Chemical weapons have been used since in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, by governments that calculated the benefits outweighed the diplomatic costs. The taboo held better than no taboo at all, but it didn't hold completely. It never does. The medical lessons from the gas wards informed treatment of chemical exposure for generations. The doctors who worked there saw things that no medical training had prepared them for, and they wrote it all down. The symptoms, the progression, the treatments that worked, the treatments that didn't. Modern protocols for treating chemical exposure, for decontamination, for respiratory support in toxic inhalation cases, all of it traces back to those desperate attempts to save gassed soldiers in 1915. The horror of chemical warfare also accelerated research into protective equipment. Gas masks evolved from improvised cloth pads soaked in chemical solutions to sophisticated filtered respirators with replaceable canisters. Detection methods improved. Training programs taught soldiers how to recognize different gases by smell, by color, by the symptoms of exposure, and how to respond appropriately. None of this made chemical warfare acceptable, but it made it survivable, at least sometimes. Let's back up. Before surgery, before blood transfusions, before any kind of treatment, you have to get the wounded soldier from the battlefield to somewhere a doctor can work on him. In 1914, this was a bigger problem than it sounds. The traditional method was stretcher bearers, two men carrying a canvas stretcher across broken ground, under fire, for hundreds of yards, sometimes miles. It was slow. It was exhausting. It was dangerous. Stretcher bearers died almost as often as the soldiers they were trying to save. The stretchers themselves were simple but effective. Canvas stretched between two wooden poles, light enough for two men to carry, strong enough to hold a full-grown soldier. The problem wasn't the stretchers. The problem was the terrain. No Man's Land was a nightmare landscape of shell craters and barbed wire and corpses that couldn't be recovered. The stretcher bearers had to navigate this while carrying 200 pounds of wounded man, while machine guns fired and shells exploded around them, while snipers watched for movement. They couldn't move in straight lines. They had to zigzag between craters, find gaps in the wire, take cover when the fire got too heavy. A journey of 200 yards might take an hour. Horse-drawn ambulances were marginally better, but useless in mud, and the Western Front was essentially one continuous mud pit from Belgium to Switzerland. The horses sank to their bellies. The wheels bogged down. Artillery had churned the landscape into a moonscape where nothing with wheels could pass. Some ambulances used teams of men instead of horses, pulling the carts by hand through the worst sections. But this was slow and exhausted the teams quickly. The wounded waited, and while they waited, they bled. And while they bled, they died. What the war needed was a new technology that could move faster than a horse, navigate rough terrain, and carry multiple casualties at once. What the war got was the motorized ambulance. Early versions were basically trucks with stretchers bolted to the beds, civilian vehicles pressed into military service with minimal modifications. They were rough, loud, unreliable, and infinitely better than anything that came before. The engines broke down constantly. The tyres punctured on debris. The springs, if there were any, did little to cushion the ride, but they moved under their own power, didn't get tired, and could carry more patients than any horse-drawn vehicle. By 1916, ambulance corps were an essential part of military medicine. Young men who couldn't or wouldn't fight found ways to serve by driving wounded soldiers away from the front. Some of them were conscientious objectors, morally opposed to killing but willing to risk their lives saving others. Some were too young to fight, eager boys who'd lied about their age to get closer to the action. Some were too old or medically unfit, or had other disqualifications that kept them out of combat but not out of danger. Some were artists and writers who wanted to see the war without killing anyone, who thought that driving an ambulance was a way to bear witness without becoming complicit in the slaughter. Ernest Hemingway drove an ambulance in Italy. He was 18 years old, too young for the American Army, but the Red Cross would take anyone who could drive. He was wounded by mortar fire near the front line, carried to safety by stretcher bearers, and spent months recovering in a hospital in Milan. The experience shaped his writing for the rest of his life. John Dos Passos and E. Cummings drove ambulances too, both American writers who would transform their experiences into literature. Walt Disney applied to be an ambulance driver, but was rejected for being too young. He was 16. He later drove for the Red Cross in France after the war ended, but he missed the worst of it. The ambulance corps became a strange fellowship of idealists and adventurers, doing brutal work in impossible conditions. They didn't carry weapons. They drove toward the sound of guns while everyone else drove away. Many of them died. The Red Cross emblem on their vehicles was supposed to protect them under international law, but shells don't read treaties and accidents don't care about emblems. The ones who survived never forgot the sound of wounded men screaming in the back of a truck, bouncing over shell craters in the dark. The drivers developed their own techniques and their own culture. They learned to navigate by sound, following the artillery to find where casualties would be heaviest. They learned to prioritize, loading the most critical cases first, making rapid decisions about who could wait and who couldn't. They learned to work under fire, to keep driving when shells were falling around them, to trust that getting the wounded to care was worth the risk. They learned to change tires in the dark, to repair engines with improvised parts, to keep vehicles running long past their expected lifespan. The vehicles themselves evolved throughout the war. Early ambulances were civilian vehicles pressed into service, uncomfortable and unreliable. Later versions were purpose-built, with better suspension, more stretcher capacity, enclosed bodies that protected patients from the elements. Some were converted buses that could carry dozens of walking wounded. Others were specialized vehicles designed for the worst terrain, with higher ground clearance and better traction. The Ford Model T, cheap and rugged and widely available, became a common ambulance chassis. Thousands of them bounced across the battlefields, carrying wounded men to safety. Modern emergency medical services, the ambulances that might someday save your life, descend directly from those improvised transport systems of World War I. The idea that you need specialized vehicles to move patients, trained personnel to care for them in transit, a coordinated system to get them to appropriate care. All of this emerged from the chaos of the Western Front. The paramedics in your local fire station are the professional descendants of those ambulance drivers who figured out, under impossible circumstances, how to keep wounded men alive long enough to reach a surgeon. Behind every surgeon, behind every doctor, behind every stretcher bearer and ambulance driver were the nurses. Thousands of them, most of them women, in an era when women weren't supposed to see blood or death or the naked bodies of strange men. They saw all of those things and more. Nursing in World War I was not like nursing today. There were no antibiotics, so preventing infection meant constant vigilance with antiseptic and clean bandages, changing dressings whenever they became soiled, watching for the first signs of inflammation or fever. There were no machines to monitor vital signs, so nurses watched patients hour after hour, checking pulses by hand, counting respirations, alert for changes that might mean the difference between life and death. There was no psychological preparation for the scale of suffering they would witness. They figured it out as they went. Many of the nurses came from privileged backgrounds. They were the daughters of doctors and lawyers and businessmen, women who had grown up with servants and comfort, who had never emptied a bedpan or cleaned a wound in their lives. They volunteered because they wanted to help, because they couldn't stand sitting at home while men died, because nursing seemed like something useful they could actually do. The voluntary aid detachments, the VADs, provided a structure for these women to serve. They received basic training, enough to be useful, and were deployed to hospitals in France and Belgium and England and wherever else they were needed. The nurses worked in field hospitals and casualty clearing stations and base hospitals behind the lines. Some worked on hospital ships, evacuating wounded from France to England, caring for patients during the dangerous channel crossing where submarines lurked and a torpedo hit could sink a ship full of helpless men. Some worked in convalescent homes where men recovered from injuries that would never fully heal, learning to live with missing limbs and missing faces and missing pieces of themselves. They changed bandages that revealed wounds too terrible to describe, raw tissue and exposed bone, and the slow decay of gangrene. They held the hands of men who were dying and knew they were dying, who wanted only not to be alone at the end. They wrote letters home for soldiers who couldn't write, sometimes delivering the last words a family would ever receive. The conditions were almost impossible. 12-hour shifts that often stretched to 16 or 20 or longer during major offensives. Never enough supplies, never enough beds, never enough hands. They rationed bandages, washed and reused dressings that should have been disposable, improvised when the supply trains failed to arrive. Rats in the wards, bold enough to run across patients' beds to gnaw at wounds if no one was watching. Lice everywhere, in the bedding, in the bandages, in the hair and clothes of patients and staff alike. The constant presence of death as a background hum. A patient who was fine this morning, gone by afternoon. A bed emptied and refilled before the sheets were changed. And through it all, the expectation that nurses would be calm, competent, nurturing, professional. They weren't supposed to cry, at least not where anyone could see. They weren't supposed to flinch from wounds that would have made experienced surgeons pause. They weren't supposed to show fear when the shells landed close enough to shake the building, or when word came that the Germans were advancing and the hospital might need to evacuate. They were supposed to be angels, ministering to the wounded with gentle hands and soothing voices. Never mind that they were exhausted and traumatized and working in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable in peacetime. The ones who survived the war often struggled to explain what they'd done. The words didn't exist for the things they'd seen. They came home to families who wanted to hear heroic stories but couldn't handle the truth, who preferred to imagine their daughters bandaging minor cuts rather than holding men together while surgeons amputated. Many nurses never talked about their experiences at all. They put the uniforms away, resumed their lives, carried the memories in silence. Some became advocates for nursing as a profession, using their wartime experience to push for better training and better recognition. Some became activists for peace, determined that what they'd witnessed should never happen again. The nursing profession was transformed by the war. Before 1914, nursing was often seen as a respectable occupation for women who needed to work, but not a true profession with standards and training and recognition. The nurses were auxiliaries, helpers, women who did what the doctors told them and otherwise stayed out of the way. After the war, nursing had proven itself essential. The women who served had developed skills that civilian nurses didn't have, had handled responsibilities that civilian nurses never faced. They demanded recognition, better training programs, professional organizations, a voice in medical decisions. They had earned it in the wards and clearing stations, holding the medical system together through 4 years of industrial slaughter. Some of the nurses became famous. Edith Cavell was a British nurse working in Belgium when the war started. She helped Allied soldiers escape from occupied territory, guiding them to the neutral Netherlands, and was eventually caught by the Germans. She admitted what she'd done, refusing to lie even to save herself, and was sentenced to death. The execution was carried out by firing squad in October 1915. She was 50 years old. Her last words, reportedly, were, "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness towards anyone." She became a martyr, her death used for propaganda on both sides. But she was also a real person who died for doing what she thought was right. Most of the nurses remained anonymous, their contributions recorded only in hospital registers and their own memories. But they changed medicine forever, not through dramatic discoveries, but through the steady accumulation of practical knowledge about how to keep people alive when everything is trying to kill them. Every nurse today, in every hospital and clinic and care facility, inherits a legacy that was forged in the mud and blood of the Western Front. The war ended in 1918. The medicine didn't. Millions of soldiers went home carrying wounds that would never fully heal, physical and psychological scars that shaped the rest of their lives. Some were missing limbs, learning to navigate a world designed for people with arms and legs they no longer had. Some were missing faces, hiding from mirrors and strangers and the expressions of their own families. Some were missing pieces of their minds, flinching at loud noises, unable to sleep, haunted by memories that wouldn't fade. The rehabilitation industry barely existed before the war. Prosthetic limbs were primitive, uncomfortable, and stigmatized. A man with a wooden leg was obviously damaged, obviously incomplete, obviously not the person he used to be. Psychiatric care for veterans was almost non-existent. If you came home broken in your mind, your options were limited. Your family could care for you, you could be committed to an asylum, or you could end up on the street. The idea that the government owed something to soldiers who had sacrificed their bodies for their country was novel and controversial. Taxpayers didn't want to pay for other people's problems, even if those problems were directly caused by government policy. The sheer number of casualties made it impossible to ignore. Britain alone had over 2 million wounded survivors, men who needed ongoing medical care, who needed artificial limbs, who needed psychiatric treatment, who needed help finding work when their old jobs were no longer possible. France had more. Germany had more. Every country that had fought had its own population of broken men, and every government had to figure out what to do with them. The systems built to provide these things, imperfect as they were, became the foundation for modern veteran care. Prosthetic technology advanced rapidly out of necessity. Before the war, artificial limbs were mostly wooden pegs and hooks, crude devices that restored minimal function and no appearance of normalcy. After the war, engineers developed articulated joints that could bend like real knees and elbows. They developed more comfortable sockets that fit the residual limb without causing sores. They developed specialized attachments for different tasks, so a farmer who lost an arm could get a prosthetic that let him work his land, and a clerk who lost a leg could get one that let him walk to the office. The technology was still primitive by modern standards. The knees locked and unlocked manually. The hands couldn't grip with any precision. The fit was often painful after hours of use. But it was a vast improvement over what had existed before. Men who would have been bedridden or wheelchair-bound were walking again. Men who would have been unable to work were holding jobs. The artificial limb went from being a mark of shame to being a tool of independence. Some of the wounded became advocates. They wrote books about their experiences, gave speeches about what they'd sacrificed, demanded that their sacrifices be acknowledged. Organizations of disabled veterans became political forces, pushing for pensions, for medical care, for recognition. The American Legion, the veterans of foreign wars, the Royal British Legion, all of them trace their origins to veterans of World War I who organized to demand what they were owed. Some disappeared into asylums or died on the streets, forgotten by the countries they'd fought for, the ones who couldn't work, who couldn't function, who had no family to care for them, often ended up in institutions or homeless shelters or nowhere at all. Most fell somewhere in between, living quiet lives with loud nightmares. They held jobs and raised families and went to church on Sundays. They didn't talk about what they'd seen because no one wanted to hear it, because the words didn't exist anyway. They woke up screaming, and their wives learned not to ask. They flinched at car backfires and fireworks and thunderstorms. They carried their burdens without explaining them, because explaining would mean remembering, and remembering was the one thing they couldn't bear. The last combat veteran of World War I died in 2012. His name was Claude Schul, and he was 110 years old. He had served in the British Royal Navy, transferred to the Royal Australian Navy, lived long enough to see wars he'd hoped would never happen. He had watched medicine transform from something that mostly watched people die into something that could actually save them. He had seen the horse-drawn ambulances replaced by helicopters, the candle-lit operating tents replaced by climate-controlled surgical suites, the carbolic acid replaced by antibiotics. He had lived through a century of advances that would have seemed like miracles to the surgeons of 1916. All of that transformation had roots in the mud of France and Belgium, where doctors and nurses and ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers made up the rules as they went along. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. Nobody knew what else to do. So they tried things. They kept what worked and discarded what didn't. They learned from their failures and built on their successes. The lessons learned in those 4 years shaped everything that came after. The blood banks and trauma surgery and psychiatric treatment and rehabilitation medicine. All of it flows from the desperate innovations of the Great War. The next time you see an ambulance racing through traffic, the next time you hear about a successful blood transfusion, the next time someone mentions PTSD or plastic surgery or emergency medicine, remember where it came from. Remember the surgeons operating by candlelight, the nurses holding dying men's hands, the ambulance drivers navigating shell craters in the dark. Remember the soldiers who survived wounds that should have killed them and the ones who didn't. Medicine learned more in those 4 years than in the previous 4 decades, and the price of that education was measured in millions of lives. We still use what they learned. We still benefit from their suffering. The least we can do is remember.